Welcome to this month's installment of Creation Justice webinars. This is the place where we focus on some of the most critical issues facing our world today, and we not only seek to grow in our awareness, but also grow in action that makes love visible. My name is Brooks Barrett. I'm the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. As always, I am joined by my co-host, that trumpet for justice coming out of Birmingham, Alabama, the Reverend Michael Malcolm, who is the Executive Director for Alabama Interfaith Power and Light and the People's Justice Council. Michael, delighted to be with you today as we focus on really one of the most important topics we could be focused on in this time and in this place. I'm interested to get your thoughts as we frame our conversation for today. We've got some great guests that I'm about to introduce, but before we do so, help us to think about this, because when I think about people of faith and the core values that we hold sacred, I think about justice for the poor, I think about caring for God's creation, and I think about welcoming the stranger. So today we're putting these all together in this webinar. And so tell me your thoughts as we get started today.
Yeah, Brooks, I recently was in a meeting where we were trying to get people to run for the board of directors for an electric co-op. And during this meeting, we began to have conversations, and we described what was going on in the community, and we started having conversations about the conditions that the vulnerable members in the community lived in and lived under. And after exhausting our presentation, one of our guests stated that he had no problems with his electric co-op. He said that his bills were the lowest that he's ever had, and there was no issues that he had with the electric co-op itself. And so he had didn't want to take any action against this co-op. And to be honest with you, it saddened me. And it saddened me because he failed to see those around him. We just described what was happening to the community members that didn't live in his home, but he failed to see that. And my friend and my brother in this fight for equity and justice, Terrence Lester, stated in this book, I See You, How Love Opens Our Eyes to Invisible People. He said this, he said, for those of us who ended up with supports, homes to sleep in, and enough money to buy groceries, what role do we play in something so seemingly complex and systemic? We must first recognize our privilege and move toward creating a more equitable and just environment for everyone to live in. Reverend Lester's book is dealing with houselessness and poverty and our need for seeing the other. And although Rev is speaking of poverty and houselessness, I think that the sentiment applies to our conversation today. We are responsible for one another in the beloved community. The us is one of the US is one of our largest emitters. Our decisions of comfort have caused damage to others. Climate instability has caused climate migration. We are responsible. People are losing their homes, their land, and their culture. We are responsible. People are losing their communities. We are responsible. Climate migration is an international security threat. We are responsible. And because we are responsible, we must do all that we can to care for the communities that we are responsible for. And we are grateful today for this particular conversation because it helps us to discuss this whole thing of climate migration, but also providing us tools to be able to combat this and to help care for our communities. Thank you all for being with us, and I definitely look forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Michael, for that framing for today. Appreciate the emphasis on seeing the other. I'm now going to introduce our three panelists for today in the order that they'll be speaking. Up first, we will have the Reverend Irene Hassan, who is the United Church of Christ Minister for Refugee and Migration Services. Previously, Hassan managed the Refugee Employment Department of the Episcopal Diocese Refugee Settlement Office in Seattle, Washington. She's also served as lead pastor for a church in Hawaii and as a chaplain for the Institute for Human Services, Hawaii's largest homeless services provider. We'll then have Drocella Mugorewera, who arrived in the United States in 2008 from Rwanda, where she held a number of critical roles and positions, including service as the country's Secretary of Lands, Environment, Forestry, Water, and Mines. Drocella is now the Executive Director for Bridge Refugee Services, the only resettlement agency in East Tennessee since 1982. She'll depart from her present role there in the next month as she embarks on a new calling to build leaders, to empower people, and to spread her gifts more broadly. Now, she has indeed gained a noted reputation as a storyteller, a trainer specializing in refugee integration, and a leader rooted in faith. And then our third speaker today will be Geronimo Ramirez, who is an Ixil Maya and was born several years before the signing of the peace accords in Guatemala. He was raised by his maternal grandmother, who was also one of his strongest mentors. His grandmother is a survival of the internal armed conflict and genocide and is a defender of human rights. At the age of 13, he began to defend his people, their lands, territories, human rights, and the rights of Mother Earth. In the United States, he is a community organizer and a youth leader in the International Mayan League, and also provides interpretation in his language, Maya Ixil. We are grateful for each one of you. Irene, if you could get us started.
Hi, Brooks. Thanks for having me. And I also want to say thank you to Reverend Michael of Interfaith Power and Light. That was a really powerful opening. And as someone with a background in both refugee work and homeless services work, I totally agree that displacement and empowerment for vulnerable populations is something that we, the church, are meant to engage responsibly. And that is why we're all here today, is to learn more and pray together about how we could do that. So I am just going to give you some of the nuts and bolts about what climate change and migration looks like right now, what it's predicted to look like in the future, and give you some context for what our other speakers, Drocella and Geronimo, are going to be talking about. So this will just be real quick. Let me pull up this very short PowerPoint. Okay, everyone can see that? Can anyone see that? Yes, okay, great.
Yes, we can see. Oh, yes, it's in presenter mode now. Thank you.
Cool. So, as Brooke said, this is an intersection of environmental and justice ministries and refugee and migration ministries, both of which are not small topics. And so knowing where to start when we look at both of these topics and how they intersect is important for knowing what can I do as a human being and what can we do together as the church. So some statistics on what climate migration looks like is it's estimated across several research studies that between 200 and 500 million people are going to be forcibly displaced by climate change before the year 2050. That's within most of our lifetimes. And that is a lot of people. That is a good chunk of the Earth's population. I want to jump to the, excuse me, I'm recovering from a bit of a cold, so I might speak a little slow. I want to jump to my last point here on this slide, though, in that climate change by itself is usually not the only driver of migration. There are usually a multitude of other factors that cause people to forcibly migrate that are included with climate migration. I want to give you an example. We're seeing a lot of migration in the US that is voluntary. It is not forced migration. And a lot of that migration has to do with the changes in the ways that we work, the changes of the ways that we interact, the pandemic. And we're seeing that a lot of folks are actually going towards areas that have higher risk of environmental impact. For example, some of the hottest housing markets in the United States right now include Austin, Texas, Florida, Tennessee. And as we've also seen in the news, these are also places that have high risk of climate disasters that happen to them. So I would just want to use that as an example that not always people migrate just because of climate change. Climate change is usually a driving factor that's combined with other forces. For example, if there is political instability, if there's war, if these two things combined are creating things like starvation among the populations, if there's inequity among the population, there's a lot of reasons why people migrate. That climate change is one of the factors, but not the only factor. So let me jump back up to the second point in this slide, and that's that when we do see folks that migrate because of climate change, it's usually from poorer and more vulnerable countries, such as sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East. I want to emphasize throughout this presentation that that should not be unilateral. And that brings me to my next point that Reverend Michael talked about some, that the average US citizen puts out 16 tons per individual of, Brooks could describe this better. My mom's an environmental engineer. She explained to me what 16 tons means. It basically means how much output you're gonna put in your lifetime into creating negative environmental impact, whereas the average individual in Uganda only puts out 0.1 ton. That is a completely different amount of environmental impact that a person puts out. So just because folks from poorer and more vulnerable countries, I would say that Uganda is considered to be a poorer and more vulnerable country than the United States in general, just because that is where folks that are experiencing higher impacts of climate migration are coming from, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're responsible for the issues that are causing their migration. And this is where the narrative really needs to change, is that we are all in this together. We are all responsible for our one planet that we live on and for the changes that are impacting it. Just because folks from somewhere like Uganda are migrating because of floods and drought and food insecurity doesn't mean that they're responsible for those things happening. And I have heard Drocella speak on this topic, and I'm very excited to hear more about her wisdom on that. So in summary, there's going to be a lot of migration that happens in the next several decades. And a lot of that can be attributed to climate change, but there's a multitude of factors that go into it, mainly about the socioeconomic status of a country or the political and economic security of that country, people's ability to access freedom and basic needs in that country. That's all combined. And these aren't things that happen in a vacuum. Things that people do in the United States or Canada or Germany affect what people do in Afghanistan or Uganda or Somalia, and it's all interchangeable. So per migration in particular, as you know, a concept, I just want to briefly let you know that migration patterns are not consistent in the way that they're approached by westernized countries, by world superpowers that folks typically migrate to rather than away from. The United States is an example of this. It's a country that folks tend to migrate to rather than away from. There is not really any sort of standardized process that ensures that a person is a refugee. The only thing that has ever really been put together is a really vague sentence from the 1951 Refugee Convention that states that a person can be considered a refugee when they can demonstrate that they will be killed in their country of origin for having certain political or religious beliefs. That's it. That's the only demarcation. And it's clear that modern governments are sort of manipulating that to mean what they want it to mean. I want to use the Syria response versus the Ukrainian response as an example. 5-6 years ago, we saw huge masses, and we still see huge masses of Syrians that are migrating out of Syria and coming towards Europe. And the response was increased securitization of Europe and the United States, trying to find reasons why these foreigners couldn't come in, as opposed to the Ukraine response we're seeing now, in which the outpouring of generosity and support, which has been overwhelmingly wonderful to see, how many Western nations are willing to step forward and support Ukrainian refugees as they flee. Unfortunately, we did not see the same response happen to Syria. It is very easy to pick and choose because there is no standardization across the board about what really constitutes a refugee. No, in terms of climate migration, there's never ever been any legislation passed about climate migration in particular. Like I said, climate change and migration are two very big topics that aren't usually approached with any sort of very directness. So there's nothing in anything in US law or really any other law internationally about climate change as being a demarcator of why a person should be standardized as a refugee or asylum seeker. And like I said, this trend towards securitization of borders, including our own border, has been the way that most countries that have in-migration rather than out-migration have been addressing the growing migration crisis. Instead of examining factors like the growing need to address climate change and migration, as we see it's going to be a very big deal in the next coming decades, Western superpowers have decided to just figure out ways to more effectively keep people out. We are about to hit a landmark in having 100 million forcibly displaced persons worldwide. There has never, ever been that many people that have been forcibly displaced worldwide in the history of record keeping. And so the fact that there is no standardized response, there is no conversation about it, climate change as a factor is being effectively ignored, and that the overwhelming response of in migration countries has been to securitize rather than find different ways to be effective in asylum. It's all alarming, and this is all things that we should be paying attention to. And so I just want to say these couple last things. I really want to keep my part short because I think that Drocella's and Geronimo's are going to be more important, is that this idea of us versus them, I really want to emphasize that that is not true. Obviously, it's all one planet, but the narrative is wrong. It's not us helping them, right? The securitization of the border and saying we get to choose who gets to come in. It's going to be easier for us to take in this type of refugee than this type of refugee, so let's choose them. It's the wrong type of narrative. Folks that come from countries that have been affected by climate change are actually going to be the best professional wisdom on how we can approach migration, how we can approach climate change most effectively. And so my hope from this webinar is that we learn how to listen and how to empower those who have experienced climate disasters and forced migration because of factors that led into climate change and factors in their country that exacerbated it, and that we are able to lift up their voices so that we can have a stronger future together as a cleaner planet, as a planet that cares more about making sure that we still have a planet in 50 years and that we care about the people who live on it. And this direction of not viewing folks that come from countries that have experienced the impact of climate change. There's actually a word for it. It's called adaptive migration rather than victims of forced migration. And viewing folks as adapting to their environment empowers them to be able to change the narrative about how we speak about our countries, their countries, and how we're going to work together in the future to assure that all of us have a safe planet to live on together. So what can the church do? I'll let Thaddeus talk more about how you can advocate for changes to the refugee resettlement system, advocate for changes away from securitization and more conversations about what the future of migration will look like. Because obviously just religious and political persecution, while those are very important factors for consideration when considering forced migration, they're obviously not the only factors. And we have a changing world in which more people are migrating, more people than ever in history. You can also learn more about asylum accompaniment. We don't have enough churches in the UCC that are dedicated to asylum accompaniment. So please contact me if you would like to learn how to be an asylum accompaniment church. That would be a really valuable way to help folks that are fleeing factors of climate migration combined with other factors to find a safe environment and find home. You could also donate and volunteer. Mainly right now, what we need is donations to, of course, OGHS, but also volunteering with our border shelters as they prepare for the end of Title 42, which again, will be talked about at the end of this, and continuing to learn. So thank you for coming to this webinar and being open and willing to learn about these very important issues that are coming together at an important point in history. And that's all I have for now. Thank you so much, Brooks. I'll pass it on to whoever's next. I think it's Drocella.
Thank you so much, Irene, for that comprehensive introduction. And we will now turn things over to Drocella.
Thank you, Brooks and Irene. Ladies and gentlemen, I want this to be participative. So last time when I was on a podcast, they did ask me one small action I did, but that had a greater impact. And I said that when I was a cabinet minister, I did environmental campaign. I campaigned for more tree planting, and I planted thousands of trees. Please put in the chat which action you personally did so that has an impact on environment. I would like to hear from you. So I believe that preventing and mitigating climate change is everybody's business. You and I have shared responsibilities to protect our planet and our future generations. We must stand for humanitarian programs and change the narrative around people who are politicizing them. It is evening of June 17, 2008, and I find myself forced to flee my lovely native country, Rwanda, without any direction because of persecution. I was scared, confused, disoriented, frustrated, and angry. My life was in hands of two strange men who could have done anything for me. I only relied on trusting God to save my life. I lost a country, I lost a family, I lost friends, a career, and everything material I invested in for more than 40 years. I did not talk to my family for a year, and I didn't see my children for 2 years. My youngest daughter was 12 years old when I fled my country. I lost 2 houses and my cars and became homeless for a couple of months. The journey was painful, but also hopeful. I had to build strong muscles and work hard so I can provide for my family members when I see them again. I'm grateful that America saved my life, provided basic needs like shelter, food, healthcare, and facilitated family reunification. One of my quotes says, "You can lose material possessions and positions, but you can never lose who you are. Our resilience leads to our destiny. Sometimes we are talking about those impacts, but let us talk also about mental health. Imagine being separated from your family. Now we are seeing like Ukrainians, and it is happening in other parts of the world. When you leave behind, you leave the ones. Some are dying. So it takes time to heal and to understand what's going on, and you feel abandoned by the whole world. Let us talk about disability. People are getting shot, not killed only, and they are not able to work. They lose everything. And there are so many trees who are cut so they can provide food and cook food for people in refugee camps. And now you can imagine, for example, how many trees will be cut to rebuild those countries that are torn down by wars and violence. So now we can say, what can we do? And I'm really very grateful for faith-based organizations, because they welcome the stranger, they feed the hungry, and they give them clothes. And then the spirituality need also is something I sometimes talk about, how faith has a great impact in the refugee life. And we are grateful for accompanying these people suffering from misery, persecution, and abandonment, and even isolation, so they can find new people, new families to help them to recover and to start from scratch. So what can we do better now? And I want to remind, like, our voices and our votes, they matter. People who are taking decision, they need something from us, we need something from them. We have to find a win-win situation to save our planet. If we advocate for equity, now many people talk about Afghanistan, they are talking about Ukrainians. I was trained in Ukraine, this is where I graduated from. And I feel the pain from Ukrainians. But there are other millions of people who are here, there in African continent and elsewhere, who even finished the process, the screening process, but are waiting to go to a safe haven for years. I urge you to advocate for all those people so our countries can be open to them, because now I see inequity in what the world is doing, focusing on some nationalities and forgetting others. And I think also the biggest crisis we have, especially in America, since this is where we are, is about affordable housing. This affordable housing crisis will never be resolved unless faith-based and inspired organizations invest heavily in this affordable and transitional housing. And we are capable. I count faith-based inspired organizations as industries. They have money, they have people, they have skills, they have power, they have everything. Let us use them to see how we can change things. And then we have to hold our leaders accountable for the actions they're taking, but also we have to remind them they're adhered on multilateral conventions regarding environment. So we have a shared responsibility, as I said before. Remember, our voice and our votes matter for them. June 5th is coming. What are we planning to do? June 5th is International Environmental Day. Collectively, can we organize a day of prayer for our planet? I believe in the power of prayers. We can pray for the planet and the future generation and those people who do not want to change or who want to get more profits and destroy our environment. how can we support the resettlement agencies and other organizations to help refugees and immigrants integrate in the new countries? Most importantly, as advocates, we have to change our approach in terms of advocacy. What I have seen, they say that everything relies on leadership, but everything also relies on relationship. We have to make sure that we are building relationships with people who are making decisions, our lawmakers and other people. Because from your experience and maybe from mine also, I have seen that sometimes we assume that they understand issues, but they don't. We have to find time to sit with them together, to drink coffee with them, to party with them, and talk about these climate change and migration issues we are talking about, because many of them are not educated about these problems. And then we can empower displaced people by assisting them building new communities immediately upon arrival in their new home countries, and invite them around the table when we discuss climate change issues. I'm part of the Refugee Congress, and we say that there is no business for us without us. So we cannot talk about migration when really in the Reverend Irene, you did say that you have to hear from people who live the experience, because they are experts in the matters. And then we can also advocate for enough funding for social workers in the industry. I am in the refugee settlement, but you cannot see how much work social workers, case managers are doing for these people, the burnout. There is a secondary trauma because of all the things they are listening. So we have to advocate for the federal government and other agencies invest heavily in paying enough social workers so they can make career in this sector, and people can get services they deserve, with people also making career in their profession. We can develop and display educational tools in our places of worship. If you have some, you can put in the church. So sometimes when I go to church, I want to see, for example, when they talk about Genesis, creation, when I was the Minister of Environment in my country, this is what I used to say. You know, I was simplifying things, the water we drink, the air we breathe. Imagine if we couldn't have air, and then they would say, go and fetch air somewhere else. We have to be grateful. But I think developing those tools and display them in our churches and community rooms that can educate people, even in our homes, talk about environment day in and day out to our children, to our friends, wherever we have a party. Environment is a cross-cutting issue. So we have to talk about it everywhere where we are. And teachers and preachers, please, every day, every talk you have, every opportunity, we have to teach people how we are in danger and how everybody has a shared responsibility to save our planet and our future generation. You're teaching on Sundays or Saturdays, please include environment issues every day. And then help displaced people to understand mental health and seek help, because sometimes these are like taboo, or they do not understand why they say, I'm not crazy. It does take time for them really to heal and to adapt, because they think the trauma and the situation they have gone through, they don't understand it. Sometimes they say they are okay, but they are not okay. And in concluding, I just wanted to leave you with my other quote. The problem is not starting from the bottom. The problem is staying at the bottom. No matter where you are today, worrying about tomorrow, or suffering from impact from COVID-19, suffering from poverty or other stresses, remember, we are created for abundance. And we have abundant resources. People said, oh, refugees and immigrants are coming to take resources. We have enough for now and future generations. The scarcity of resources is in our mind, in our hearts. There is enough for everybody on this planet. And we are overcomers. I think that you are worthy and deserving, and let us take care of our planet so it can take care of us tomorrow and for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks. Much appreciated, and we receive them heartfelt. I now want to take a moment to say that for our next panelist, as we hear from Geronimo Ramirez, that he'll be speaking in Spanish, and we are providing translation services so that if you'd like to hear the translation in English, what you can do is you can, if you're on a computer, go to the bottom of your screen, click on the interpretation icon, and then select English. And that will enable you to hear the English interpreter that we have. And so just to repeat that so people have time to do that, go and look for the interpreter icon and click on that, and then click on English so that you can hear the interpretation from Spanish into English. All right, and now we will turn things over to Geronimo.
Tantish Kailish, in Shell, in Zanaganetu Ishim Chawa. Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Mi nombre es Geronimo Ramírez. Soy Maya Ishil. Vengo de las tierras del maíz, Guatemala, y estoy aquí actualmente en las sagradas tierras de la nación Piscataway, que actualmente es llamado Virginia y Maryland. Y gracias por este tiempo. Solo quiero recordar que solo soy un mensajero de mi abuela sobreviviente del genocidio, de abuelas y abuelos que sobrevivieron del genocidio en contra de la comunidad de los pueblos originarios. Yo soy líder juvenil dentro de Liga Maya Internacional, una organización, la primera organización en Estados Unidos, liderada por mujeres mayas, por pueblos mayas y también por aliados, fundado por abuelas y abuelos que fueron desplazados forzadamente en tiempos del conflicto armado, en tiempos del genocidio por el Estado. Sí, por más de 500 años, los pueblos indígenas, mi pueblo, como otros pueblos indígenas, hemos vivido el despojo de nuestras tierras, el robo de nuestras tierras. Y el robo de nuestras tierras y la falta de certeza jurídica sobre nuestras tierras, que los estados coloniales no reconocen que nosotros tenemos derechos sobre nuestras tierras y no nos han dado el derecho de estar sobre nuestras tierras. Eso ha permitido el despojo forzado. Eso es el factor principal del cambio climático. Hoy en día, los primeros que sufrimos y experimentamos el cambio climático somos nosotros, los pueblos originarios, porque directamente somos afectados por la destrucción de nuestra madre tierra, de nuestra madre naturaleza. Si ustedes algún momento habían escuchado que los pueblos indígenas, los pueblos originarios, somos los guardianes de la tierra, somos los guardianes de la madre naturaleza. Eso es lo que nos ha enseñado nuestras abuelas y nuestros abuelos desde el inicio de nuestra cosmovisión. Y también la invasión, sabemos que la invasión hace más de 500 años, en su estado, en su continuidad, en su seguimiento como un estado colonial y racista, ha traído genocidio, la deforestación de nuestros árboles, la degradación de nuestros suelos, la explotación de nuestras montañas, el desvío de nuestros ríos, también la extracción del gas, del petróleo, las hidroeléctricas, las mineras ilegales, que son megaproyectos de empresas transnacionales que están en nuestras tierras sin nuestra consulta, sin nuestro permiso y sin pedir la consulta de los pueblos. Eso ha sido la causa, una de las causas de la migración forzada. Nosotros migramos forzadamente. Nosotros no migramos para buscar una mejor vida. Nosotros migramos para salvar a nuestra vida, porque el Estado colonial toma nuestras tierras, nos despoja, explota nuestras montañas, crea megaproyectos hidroeléctricas en nuestras tierras, y eso causa el cambio climático, la sequía de nuestros ríos, los huracanes, los recientes huracanes, el despojo. Cuando nuestra comunidad, cuando nuestros pueblos defienden nuestras tierras, empieza la persecución contra nuestros líderes comunitarios. Ante estas empresas potenciales que actualmente están en nuestras tierras, nuestros líderes son perseguidos. Para salvar nuestras vidas tenemos que huir. Uno de los ejemplos es la región Ixil, Chajul, Neva, Cotzal y nuestras tierras indígenas. La región Ixil, que es mi pueblo, hay 21 comunidades mayas directamente afectadas por las empresas transnacionales sin permiso de familias, sin permiso de nuestra autoridad ancestral. Por ejemplo, las empresas la Vega 1, la Vega 2, la Enel, Hidroeléctrica Delta, Shakbal, son varias empresas impuestas en nuestros territorios. Eso empieza a forzarnos a migrar, a familias a migrar. Ya confrontados por esta inseguridad, por la criminalización de nuestros líderes, por la persecución de nuestras familias, por el despojo de nuestras tierras, por todas estas injusticias, somos obligados a migrar. Ya somos obligados a migrar. Ya es donde tenemos que cruzar México. En México sufrimos tortura, persecución, secuestro, asesinato, en manos de crímenes organizados, pero también en manos de policías y de agentes del gobierno mexicano. Ya estando en la frontera, en Estados Unidos, somos nuestra identidad, nuestros derechos como pueblos, como seres humanos, es violado. Entrando en la frontera, dice, tú eres latino, tú eres latinex. En una burbuja, en una etiqueta, somos llamados latinos. No soy latino, soy de la nación maya Ixil. Tengo mi cosmovisión, mi idioma, soy un pueblo vivo de una ascendencia maya. Actualmente, en Guatemala hay 22 naciones mayas. Un solo calendario, una sola cosmovisión, con cada pueblo de libre determinación. Y al estar en Estados Unidos somos invisibles. Vimos en la pandemia mundial, la pregunta para ustedes, ¿quién fueron los más afectados? Los pueblos indígenas. Las informaciones, habían muchas informaciones en inglés, en español, en otros idiomas. ¿Y dónde salían estas informaciones para el cuidado ante COVID o para vacunas? En medios nacionales, pero no había informaciones en nuestros idiomas mayas. Y eso puesto la vida de muchas familias en riesgo. No había informaciones en nuestros idiomas mayas, había la discriminación, la invisibilidad de los pueblos, al llamarlos latinos, y es allí donde Liga Maya, la organización donde soy líder juvenil, nuestra organización, creó una respuesta de emergencia. ¿Y cuál fue la respuesta de la emergencia? Crear promotores mayas de salud en Maryland y Virginia. La estrategia para responder las necesidades de las familias mayas fue crear promotores mayas de Maryland y promotores mayas de Virginia desde la estrategia, desde la realidad, desde una perspectiva comunitaria, desde medios comunitarios. Ahora usamos TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, otros medios, pero desde la realidad de la comunidad, que la comunidad tuviera acceso en su idioma, en lo que observa y en su confianza como líderes comunitarios. Y no quiero tardar, no quiero cerrar, no quiero finalizar sin dejar estas recomendaciones. Para que podamos luchar en realidad, y alcanzar una vida digna para los refugiados, para los forzados a emigrar y poder aportar al cambio, para que no siga el cambio climático, es importante trabajar con las organizaciones lideradas por pueblos indígenas, por pueblos originarios que conocen su realidad, que conocen su verdad. Por ejemplo, apoyando a Liga Maya Internacional en nuestro fondo solidario, donde la comida se responda a nuestra comunidad. Nuestra comunidad no se acerca tan fácil a cualquier organización, recordando el genocidio y el experimento que ha hecho el gobierno y los médicos a nuestra comunidad indígena. También es importante respetar a los líderes comunitarios, trabajar y respetar a los líderes comunitarios que conocen la comunidad, que vivimos en la comunidad. También es importante, la iglesia lo ha hecho siempre. Agradezco eso con todo el corazón, y mi familia también, nuestros pueblos también, cómo la iglesia ha trabajado con nosotros en darnos el apoyo. Pero es importante que estos espacios también, como hoy, donde se escuche a los pueblos originarios afectados. Hoy hablo por el pueblo Ixil. Falta 21 pueblos que tienen sus necesidades. Quechí es un pueblo que es perseguido actualmente. También es importante crear un lugar, una reforma, un reasentamiento en los Estados Unidos. ¿Cómo vamos a recibir a los refugiados por el cambio climático? Y es importante también recordar que para que esto tenga un alcance global, es importante incidir para que los gobiernos del Estado colonial recuerden que dar el reconocimiento y el respeto a los pueblos originarios, que nosotros respetamos a la tierra como nuestra madre. Ayer justamente mi abuela decía, ¿cómo voy a abrir el pecho de mi madre si ella es la fuente de mi vida, el río, los árboles? Entonces es recordar a los estados que los pueblos originarios tenemos el 85% de aporte a la biodiversidad. Y muchas gracias por escucharme y muchas gracias por este espacio, y que la lucha sigue siempre. Tanti Ixtete.
Thank you so much, Geronimo, for those words. I'd like to get that closing quote and share it with others as tremendous. Thank you for sharing your truth and making visible your story. We're now going to transition to a couple of minutes for questions. And Michael, is there a question that you would like to lead off with?
Yeah, I know that we've spoken about international and even some domestic migration that happens due to climate. I want to question you just for a moment about the climate migration and gentrification issue that is created by this climate migration that happens, in particular on the coast. As some of you all may know, I sit in Alabama, which has the Gulf Coast, and along the Gulf, we experience a great deal of climate devastation. And as a result, we have a lot of the people who decentralized our communities, and more often our vulnerable Black and Brown communities or indigenous communities. They've relocated them inside because they wanted the coast. Now that sea level rise and all of these various climate devastations, such as tornadoes and things of that, hurricanes and things of that nature occurring, now you have the more affluent that are coming inland and once again, decentralizing or relocating those who are most vulnerable. Can you just speak to that for a moment, this whole gentrification, and how can communities of faith be involved in protecting those communities and the cultures that are being displaced? Uh-oh, and that can go to any one of you all that feel like you can answer that.
I mean, I think advocacy is a huge one. Is that the system needs to be totally changed, and like I said, there's absolutely no recognition that this is even a topic legislatively. I think Drocella is probably our resident expert on this. Not to put you on the spot, Drocella, but I admire your work.
That's a good question. It does happen everywhere, I think, and I think. What has to be done is to make sure that when there are disasters and people are displaced, so we have to work mostly on preparedness, because sometimes we have those areas when disasters are coming or they are expected to come, and sometimes people are surprised with the consequences. So, but when they go and they are located somewhere else, they have to have decent infrastructure and training, because it's like restarting life from scratch. So we have to build the infrastructure and then equip these people who are displaced with the tool, the employment, the skills, so they can adapt and thrive, not just survive. But I think preparedness first, and then when they get there, empower them, and then with the decent infrastructure to have them and continue to advocate. Of course, when you are displaced, you miss home. And sometimes we have to organize also some kind of finding means for them at one time to go back and visit that cherish, because it's the heritage for them they are losing. I think this is what I can say, but it's sad, and I think it has to be addressed, as Reverend Irene is saying. So we have to have a strategy and advocate for those resources so people can be treated with dignity and respect.
Thank you for that response. Geronimo, I have a question for you. Your story was very powerful, and I believe that we're often motivated to act from being in touch with people's stories. And so my question for you is sort of beyond this webinar, how can people stay in touch with the reality that your people are facing, so that, because it's not one we're going to necessarily see in the New York Times. So if you have a recommendation for the Mayan International League website, or where do we go so that we stay in touch with the struggle that you're a part of.
Muchas gracias por esta pregunta. Creo que líderes de fe tienen mucho espacio y abrir estos espacios para los líderes comunitarios, líderes indígenas, esto sería un alcance donde se dé a conocer, la realidad, la raíz de la migración forzada y del cambio climático. Y nosotros estamos trabajando como Liga Maya Internacional en nuestras redes sociales. Allí se actualizan nuestros trabajos. Allí estamos trabajando con nuestra comunidad Maryland, Virginia, pero también a nivel nacional, cómo estamos trabajando con nuestra comunidad. Ahí pueden encontrar más información.
Thank you so much for that. We're nearing the top of the hour here, and we always want to respect people's time and also to invite people to stay on. One of our traditions is to always focus on what we can do in terms of actions. And so what I'm going to propose is that as we transition to this next portion, I'm going to throw out a question that kind of gets us thinking in that advocacy action direction. And then we will then transition. We've not only have Thaddeus, who is with us every month to lead us in action, but we also have my colleague, Noel Anderson, with us today, who I often look to as a veteran organizer and change maker. And so grateful to have Noel with us today. And Noel will talk, I really encourage people to stick on if you can to hear what Noel has to say about issues that we can make a difference on today. But as we transition to that portion of our program, the final question I would have is just to bring it back to the broader, I think, political context in which we deal. There is sometimes this narrative in the media from people who kind of pontificate on political issues, which I think speaks to some of what Irene had to say about the lack of legislation. But it's this idea that, if you're going to want to be elected, you should draw on a small range of issues and exclude certain issues like immigration and climate. And often there's some implication here that assumptions about appealing to either white, rural, or suburban voters, and therefore let's not talk about immigration or things that are not going to be unifiers and common ground. So within that context, where do we step out as churches, as faith communities, in providing a kind of a different orientation and voice to how we engage and should engage these issues?
I think if I can contribute to that, I think storytelling is one of the best strategies to use. Using like the real examples, and sometimes you take people who live the experience, either they are displaced or they have those consequences we are talking about with it. And then we have to see really what the decision makers make, what they care about. So we have to know them better. And then when we talk with them, we do not have to just sell ourselves, because I was thinking about how our advocacy really strategy should change. Sometimes we think about us. So we have to find them and us. If we share water, if we share air to breathe, and then give an example of what is affecting, even we can find maybe their relatives We can do research more about the people they like, the friends, and tell those stories to them. That can probably attract them to more changing. And also, I remember when we were doing a campaign on gender, explaining people why equity and gender is necessary, and we're talking about women's rights. So when you talk about your daughter, your wife, you know, people will understand, and we have to humanize the things we are talking about with climate change.
Thank you so much for that response. I really appreciate that emphasis on humanizing how people engage these issues. Irene and Geronimo, either of you have any response to that, or any final words that you would like to share before we transition to Noel and Thaddeus?
Muchas gracias. Solo agradecimiento por organizar este evento, a los líderes por darnos este espacio y reconocimiento a las comunidades indígenas desplazadas, y también por ese espacio, esa fortaleza de luchar con nosotros. Y solo recomendación, que es muy importante, les pedimos que sigan caminando con nosotros como ustedes lo han hecho desde que han llegado forzados a migrar, han llegado inmigrantes indígenas desplazados, y es nuestra petición que sigamos caminando juntos a esta lucha, reconociendo la libre determinación de los pueblos indígenas. Muchas gracias.
And I just read one of the Q&A questions. It was about how do you become an asylum accompaniment church? And one of the reasons why I said that's one way that you can help is that a lot of this climate migration in intersections with the other problems that create forced migration, you know, we see a lot of it coming to the US southern border. Currently, there's about 8,000 folks coming a day. And of course, the border is currently closed under Title 42 policies. We are hoping to see that change in a week or two. And that's going to be a really big deal. So learn how to advocate, and Noel and Thaddeus are going to be talking more about Title 42 and how to advocate for that to be a smooth transition. And then when that border does become more open to asylum, learning how to be an asylum accompaniment church. So please just send me an email at hassani@ucc.org, and I will make sure that you're set up on distribution lists to get that information. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Irene. We appreciate that. And I think that's the perfect segue into our next part. We've heard about this Title 42. Noel, would you just get us started in thinking about this issue and what we need to know?
Yes, thank you so much, Brooks, for helping organize this, and to all of our participants and panelists. It's been a great webinar, and just want to add a quick couple thoughts on asylum. You know, faith communities, human rights advocates are really the founders of our US and international asylum and refugee laws embedded in the Geneva Conventions and the 1980 Refugee Act, which is US law. Now, these programs, I've been serving as the Welcome with Dignity on the organizing team, as well as with the Interfaith Immigration Coalition Asylum Working Group. So there's a lot of urgent things happening, but these programs are under attack after being dismantled by the previous administration, would put into place the misuse of the Public Health Code Title 42. This allows Customs and Border Patrol to essentially block people from claiming asylum. The motivation of this, though, is really rooted in an anti-immigrant, discriminatory, and xenophobic politics and policymaking. Now, we do have the capacity to test people, to do the social distancing, and to provide the vaccination. In fact, that's happening in a lot of welcome hubs now with the exemptions. I'm seeing that people can't hear me. Is the audio coming through?
Yeah, no, what people need to know is that if they muted the original audio for the translation, they have to unmute it. Because
okay, yeah,
I was unable to hear you until I did that. And so I think once people do that, they should be able to.
Okay, great. So hopefully everyone can unmute original audio and you can hear me now. And So really wanted to talk about the important, we are seeing that there is exemptions of people coming through. We are processing people and they are allowed to claim their asylum with a credible fear claim, but this is still happening on a limited basis because Title 42 is still in effect. The Biden administration said they're willing to lift it starting May 23rd, but now courts have said that they might enjoin this, and we're seeing that some party leaders in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are trying to legislate an extension of Title 42. Now, I want to put this in the context of the webinar as well. I mean, the science is only now really connecting the increased hurricanes in Central America and other places over the last 20 years as rooted in climate change. This has been a significant driver, as we heard from Geronimo, about political destabilization and migration. And those increasing numbers of people trying to claim asylum at the border, they have that right to due process, to present their credible fear claim. But a lot of times that's being blocked. The majority of times it's being blocked and people are being expelled without actually their case being heard or their due process. So some people want to extend Title 42, and there's could be legislation that actually passes next week even that would extend it probably indefinitely because the conditions would be so hard to reach to actually be able to rescind it. And so we're really asking people to contact their legislators, really focusing on the Senate. I'll share both the UC Action Alert. Thank you to Katie Adams for working on that, as well as the Interfaith Immigration Coalition toolkit on that. And there is some really key decision makers, which include the senators in Colorado, Nevada, New Hampshire, Virginia, Georgia, Arizona, Montana, and of course, West Virginia. So please do what you can to mobilize some action, drive some calls, maybe host a vigil outside of one of these senators' offices, and happy to be in touch with people around how we can work together on this.